Micha. Now back from SPS and with a lot of new information and new questions. And one of the topics was WebUI at the SPS. And our question today will be WebUI against or versus Slint. Tell me.
Yeah, so I was at the SPS and I was seeing a lot of companies and talked to them. And this SPS trade fair is about production systems, more or less smart production systems or smart production solutions. And what I noticed is that lots of people, or more than I expected, are using WebUIs to code their user interfaces. And this was way more what I expected. So I expected more Qt, more GTK, more Slint's a newcomer. But what I was basically thinking that a WebUI or the web framework in general, like a browser engine like Blink, is a very complex system. And the UIs are often not that complex, and you could use something smaller to achieve the same result. And I was wondering, why is it that people are still using web UIs? And the reason is that web is an open system, and there's lots of developers, especially the front-end programmers in web. They don't earn a lot of money and compared to the back-end developers. So they're not a lot of money, let's say less money than a back-end developer. And of course, the system is known. You find resources everywhere. So it's cheaper for these kind of, especially for production system, it's cheaper to code the UI in web. It's obvious because not a lot of people see the UI. So there's only the people in the factory who see it. And the production system itself costs several million euros. And then you just buy the more expensive industrial PC. You don't need a microcontroller or something small like this to code the UI on. In the end, you have enough computation power, and then you choose the web UI.
Sounds like there are only advantages.
The disadvantage is that web itself is a complex system. I just looked it up. So the Chromium engine, how many lines do you think has the Chromium engine?
More than 5.
More than 5 lines. Yes, this is more than a hello world. This is what we know. Something, an 8-digit number. So it's around 20 million lines of code for the rendering engine. And if you have a small UI, more than 5, yes. More than 5 digits also. So it's quite big, it's quite heavy. And this is basically on top of the operating system, which also already runs on the device. And then you have another web framework or web browser and operating system on top of an operating system. So you have, let's say, in total 100 million lines of code just to display a UI that has 3 buttons.
Sounds like heavy metal.
So the minimalist in me, he's crying. That's why we also talk about Slint, because I think Slint is completely the opposite. It's quite minimalist. Slint has a 6-digit number of lines of code. All in all, 200, 300,000 lines of code with all the dependencies, I would guess. And so you can, with 1% the amount of code, you can achieve the same result. You have to see that basically this complexity that you inherit if you choose a certain web browser engine, you inherit a certain complexity. And this also comes with security issues in the end, because every 1,000 lines of code, there could be a security leak in there, some memory leak, some race condition, whatever, some kind of bug is in there. And this can become a big issue in the end if there is, for instance, for ransomware attacks. And in a factory environment, that's also part of critical infrastructure. So let's say kind of vulnerability scenario there, which I find a bit concerning, that basically millions of lines of code and non-updated web browsers run in factories and with lots of security holes in them. And that's kind of, let's say, vulnerability or security issue. And that's why using something like Slint, I try to convince the people something smaller, using a safety language like Rust can have more advantages in that regard.
Okay, the main point would be cybersecurity, less complexity, stability. What else?
The stability is a good issue. We haven't raised it yet. It depends a bit how the UI is coded, obviously. But the thing is, if you code your UI in JavaScript, your web browser UI, because it's a dynamic language, you can have some parts of untested code, and there could be some flakiness in your UI that sometimes it's working, sometimes it's not, stability issues, whatever.
Have you any idea what could be the future of Slint concerning WebUI? Could be there any additional developments? Do you have an idea?
I mean, you can compile Slint to WebAssembly. Then you can also run it in a web browser, but then you also need the browser engine, obviously. So the way of deploying it to production or to industrial machines would not be that you still have a web browser and then you run Slint in WebAssembly. That doesn't make sense. What's really important for Slint is that it stays open source, because if they go closed source in a way, which there's no plans, but if it would be a closed source system, then less people would use it, and then they would lose the platform, and then they would lose basically the traction, and then that would be the wrong way. So it stay open. The more people are using it, the better. And regarding WebUI, you can compile Slint to WebAssembly, of course, and then you can run it in a web browser. But this would mean that you still have the complexity of the browser engine, because some kind of the browser engine needs to render the WebAssembly part and the WebGL. You still need someone who codes the UI in Slint, and Slint developers are more rare than web developers. The idea would be that you don't use the WebAssembly. So you would run Slint directly without the browser engine. It should run directly on the hardware. So that would be the idea, because then you can save the whole browser UI, you reduce the amount of complexity in your system. You don't need expensive hardware. You can even run it on a microcontroller. So you have more stability, you have less security issues, you don't need to update the system that often. So that would be the advantage if you would use something less complex than a web UI, for example, Slint.
Okay, Micha, thank you very much. We will discuss that further on, and thank you for today, and see you soon.
See you.
Bye.